Last night I nearly lost him because of one glass of water. The cold plastic cup sat heavy in my hand, its contents no longer safe. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Ann Morrison, and I'm 74 years old. I live in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where the sounds of traffic never quite fade, and the rent takes half my monthly Social Security check. The walls are thin enough that I can hear Mrs. Chen next door practicing her violin scales every morning at 7 sharp. My hands shake a little when I pour my coffee now, age spots dotting my fingers like faded ink stains from all those years grading papers as a third-grade teacher. Every evening, the same exhausting ritual unfolds in our cramped space. I shuffle around our tiny kitchen, wiping down the same Formica countertop I've cleaned 10,000 times, switching off the harsh fluorescent light that makes everything look sickly yellow. The refrigerator hums its lonely song while I wait for Joe to emerge from his recliner, where he spends most days now watching old westerns on our ancient television set. For months, my husband of 50 years has insisted I drink a full glass of water before bed. "You'll get dehydrated, Annie," he says with that patronizing tone that's crept into his voice more and more lately. At our age, we can't be careless about these things. He fixes the glasses for both of us every night, placing them side by side on the chipped wooden nightstand. His big blue ceramic mug that says, "World's Greatest Dad" from some long ago Father's Day, and my smaller one with the faded pink roses that used to be my mother's. But something felt wrong. The way he watched me drink, the way his eyes followed the glass to my lips, the way he always made sure I finished every drop before he touched his own water. Last night, when he excused himself to use the bathroom, his slippers scuffing against the worn carpet, I did something I'd never done before. I swapped our glasses. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I quickly switched them, the ceramic cool against my trembling palms. It was supposed to be a small act of rebellion, a tiny test of my growing suspicions. But what happened next nearly destroyed everything I thought I knew about the man I'd loved for half a century. As the city hummed its restless lullaby outside our thin windows, I found myself staring at the water-stained ceiling, my heart still pounding hours later. Sleep wouldn't come. Something clawed at the edges of my consciousness, a terrible knowing that crept through my bones like winter cold. The familiar sounds of Joe's breathing beside me seemed different somehow, labored and uneven. Our threadbare quilt, which had covered us through countless nights of shared dreams and whispered fears, felt heavy as a shroud. I thought we were safe in our little cocoon of memories. The apartment held 50 years of our life together. Wedding photos in tarnished silver frames, Joe's aftershave still lingering on the collar of his work shirt hanging in our cramped closet, my collection of ceramic angels gathering dust on the windowsill. These things were supposed to be proof of our enduring love, evidence that we'd weathered every storm together. But what I expected from our golden years was nothing like the reality that had slowly, quietly consumed our marriage. The 1970s feel like a fairy tale now. When Joe and I first met at a community dance in Brooklyn, he was 24, working construction, his hands calloused and strong. I was 22, fresh out of teacher's college with dreams bigger than my tiny studio apartment. New York was different then, grittier, more dangerous, but somehow more alive. We built our life from nothing but hope and determination. Two young people convinced that love could conquer anything. I gave him everything. My youth dissolved into his needs. My paycheck as an elementary school teacher went toward our rent, our groceries, the endless stream of expenses that seemed to multiply like weeds. When our daughter Sarah was born, I took just 6 weeks off work before returning to my classroom, my breasts still aching with milk, my heart torn between the babies I taught and the baby I'd left at home. For 35 years, I stood in front of chalkboards and whiteboards, shaping young minds while my own dreams collected dust. I'd wanted to travel, to see the world beyond the 5 boroughs. I'd saved clippings from National Geographic, pictures of Tuscan villages and Irish coastlines, planning someday trips that never came. Instead, every extra dollar went toward Joe's business ventures, a food truck that failed, a landscaping company that folded, investments in stocks that never materialized the promised returns. "We'll travel when I retire, Annie," he'd promise, his arm around my shoulders as we looked at brochures of European river cruises. "We'll see everything then." But retirement came and went, and Joe's health began to fail. My nest egg, carefully saved over decades of brown bag lunches and secondhand clothes, drained away for medical bills and prescription medications. I became the family caregiver by default, the one who remembered doctor appointments and managed pill schedules. When Joe's mother developed dementia, I was the one who visited her in the nursing home every Sunday, bringing homemade cookies and reading her the same stories over and over. When his father had his stroke, I was the one who sat in hospital waiting rooms, holding vigil through the long nights. "Sarah's busy with her own life," Joe would say when I suggested our daughter help more. "She's got her career, her family. We can't burden her." But I saw how Sarah's life overflowed with wealth from her husband's tech fortune, how they took vacations to Aspen and the Hamptons while I clipped coupons and shopped at discount grocery stores. The pattern had established itself so gradually I barely noticed. Joe's requests became demands. His suggestions became orders. His love became conditional on my compliance. When I expressed doubts or asked questions, he'd respond with that look, a mixture of disappointment and irritation that made me feel small and ungrateful. "After everything I've done for this family," he'd say, his voice heavy with martyrdom. "After working my back to the bone to provide for you and Sarah." But I was the one who'd worked steadily for 35 years while his jobs came and went like seasonal weather. I was the one whose pension kept us afloat when his disability payments fell short. The manipulation was so subtle, so gradual, that I mistook it for love. His concern for my health, his insistence on managing our finances, his way of speaking for me in social situations, as if I'd lost the ability to form my own opinions. I told myself this was what marriage looked like after 5 decades. 2 people so intertwined they moved as one. But deep down, in the part of my heart I tried to ignore, doubt grew like a tumor. The microaggressions started small, barely noticeable drops of poison in the well of our daily life. My birthday came and went last March without acknowledgement. When I reminded Joe gently, his response stung like a slap. "We don't have money for frivolous celebrations, Annie. At our age, birthdays are just reminders we're closer to the grave." But I'd seen the bank statement. I knew about the $200 he'd spent at the liquor store the week before. Money he claimed was for household essentials. I knew about the subscription to the premium sports channel he thought I didn't notice, the $20 monthly charge that could have bought groceries for 3 days. My arthritis had been getting worse, the joints in my hands swelling like gnarled tree branches. Some mornings I could barely twist the caps off my pill bottles. When I asked Joe for help, he'd sigh dramatically, as if my physical pain was an inconvenience he hadn't bargained for. "You need to stay more active, Annie. All this sitting around is making you worse." But when I suggested we take walks together in Central Park just a few blocks from our apartment, he'd dismiss the idea. Too crowded, too much noise, too many young people with their music and their nonsense. So I stayed inside our dim apartment, my world shrinking to the distance between our bed and the kitchen sink. The fall happened on a Tuesday in February. I remember because it was the day after President's Day, and the schools were still closed. I'd been reaching for a box of cereal on the top shelf when my arthritic knee buckled. The pain shot through my leg like lightning, and I crumpled to the kitchen floor, my hip striking the linoleum with a sickening crack. I called for Joe, but the television was loud, some action movie with explosions and gunfire. I called louder, my voice cracking with desperation. Nothing. The hours crawled by like wounded animals. I tried to pull myself up using the counter. but the pain made me dizzy and nauseous. I managed to grab a dish towel from the drawer and fashioned it into a pillow for my head against the cold floor. Joe found me there 2 days later, when he finally wondered why I hadn't made his breakfast. His reaction wasn't concern or panic, it was irritation. "Annie, what are you doing on the floor? This is ridiculous." When I tried to explain, tried to tell him I'd been calling for help, his response chilled me to the bone. "I was busy. I can't be expected to hear everything." The emergency room doctors said I was lucky. A bruised hip, some strained ligaments, but nothing broken. They asked questions about my home situation with the careful neutrality of professionals who've seen too much. Was I getting enough help at home? Did I feel safe? Had I considered assisted living options? I deflected their concerns with practiced smiles and reassurances, protecting Joe's reputation even as my own body bore the evidence of his neglect. Recovery was slow and lonely. Joe made minimal effort to help, claiming his own back problems prevented him from assisting with household tasks. I hobbled around our apartment with a walker, struggling to prepare meals and manage the most basic daily activities. Our daughter Sarah visited once, bringing flowers and guilt that lasted exactly 45 minutes. "You look fine, Mom," she said, her eyes already drifting to her phone. Maybe this is a blessing in disguise. Maybe it's time to think about downsizing, finding a place with fewer stairs. She meant well, but her words felt like another small betrayal. I wasn't ready to be shuffled into some sterile facility. Wasn't ready to admit that my independence had become too much trouble for everyone around me. During those long days of healing, I had time to think. Too much time. I started noticing things I'd overlooked before, patterns that had been hiding in plain sight. The way Joe handled our mail, always collecting it before I could see what had arrived. The way he'd changed the subject whenever I asked about our finances. The way certain bills seemed to appear and disappear without explanation. One afternoon, while Joe was at his weekly visit to the barber shop, I decided to look through his desk drawers. My hands shook as I rifled through papers and folders, feeling like a criminal in my own home. What I found made my stomach drop like a stone into deep water. Hidden beneath a stack of old magazines was a letter from a debt collection agency, dated 6 months earlier. Another from a credit card company, threatening legal action. A third from our bank, warning about overdraft fees and insufficient funds. The amounts were staggering. Thousands of dollars in debt I knew nothing about, obligations that had been accumulating while I trusted Joe to manage our financial affairs. The pieces clicked together like a jigsaw puzzle, revealing a picture I didn't want to see. The water ritual. His insistence that I drink first. His careful watching to make sure I finished every drop. The strange new medications he claimed came from his doctor. Pills he said would help with my memory and mood. The way I'd been feeling more confused lately, more forgetful, more dependent on his version of reality. I sat on our bed that evening, staring at those letters until the words blurred together through my tears. 50 years of marriage, and my husband had been systematically destroying our financial security while potentially drugging me into compliance. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. The next morning, I waited until Joe left for his usual coffee with his buddy Frank at the diner down the street. With trembling fingers, I called our bank and requested account information. What I learned made me physically sick. Our savings account, the one I'd been contributing to for decades, was nearly empty. The checking account was overdrawn. There were mysterious transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, withdrawals that corresponded to Joe's alleged business meetings and medical appointments. I'd been supporting us both on my modest pension, while Joe systematically drained our assets for purposes I couldn't fathom. The money I'd earned through 35 years of teaching, the nest egg I'd planned to leave to our grandchildren, was disappearing like water through a broken dam. That night, I confronted him gently, showing him the bank statements and collection letters. His reaction was swift and brutal. "You're losing your mind, Annie. These numbers don't mean anything to someone like you. You never understood finances. That's why I handle them." He snatched the papers from my hands with a violence that made me flinch. "You're imagining things, making up stories. Maybe it's time we talk to the doctor about your memory problems." The gaslighting was masterful, so smooth and practiced it made me doubt my own perceptions. Was I losing my mind? Was I imagining the evidence of my own eyes? Joe's voice carried the authority of 5 decades, the weight of a marriage that had been built on my deference to his judgment. But something had shifted inside me during those days on the kitchen floor, something that couldn't be undone by manipulation or false concern. For the first time in years, I'd been forced to rely entirely on myself, and I'd survived. The woman who'd endured 2 days of pain in silence was stronger than either of us had realized. That's when I started paying closer attention to the nightly water ritual, watching Joe's movements with new eyes. I noticed how he prepared the glasses in the kitchen, always facing away from me. I noticed how he'd linger until I'd finished drinking, his attention focused with laser intensity. I noticed how I'd been sleeping more deeply lately, waking with headaches and a fog in my thinking that took hours to clear. The night I switched our glasses was the night everything changed. I lay awake for hours after Joe had fallen asleep beside me, his breathing gradually becoming more labored and irregular. Around 3 in the morning, he began making strange sounds, not quite snoring, but a rhythmic gasping that sent chills down my spine. By 4 a.m., he was sweating profusely, his skin clammy and cold to the touch. When I tried to wake him, he was barely responsive, his pupils dilated and his pulse rapid and weak. That's when I called 911, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through my veins. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their efficient movements filling our small apartment with controlled urgency. "Has he taken any medications tonight?" the lead paramedic asked as they loaded Joe onto a stretcher. "Any changes to his routine?" I looked at the 2 water glasses still sitting on our nightstand, evidence of the night's terrible revelation. "I don't know," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "He seemed fine when we went to bed." At the hospital, the emergency room doctor delivered news that confirmed my darkest suspicions. Joe had ingested a significant amount of sleeping medication mixed with muscle relaxants, drugs that weren't prescribed to him, drugs that could have been fatal in the concentration found in his system. "He's lucky," the doctor said, his expression grave. "Another hour, and we might not have been able to help him." I sat in that sterile waiting room as dawn broke over Manhattan, my hands folded in my lap, processing the magnitude of what had almost happened. Joe had been drugging my nightly water for months, possibly longer. The sleeping pills explained my increasing drowsiness, my memory problems, my growing dependence on his version of reality. The muscle relaxants would have made me more compliant, less likely to question his decisions or investigate our finances. If I hadn't switched those glasses, I would have continued deteriorating gradually. My independence and agency slowly poisoned away until I was nothing more than a shell of my former self. Joe would have had complete control over our assets, our home, our future. I would have become the confused, helpless old woman he'd been systematically creating. The irony was devastating. In trying to test my suspicions, I'd nearly killed my husband with his own weapon. The man who'd been slowly poisoning me for months had tasted his own medicine, and it had almost destroyed him. When Joe was finally stable and conscious, the conversation we had in his hospital room changed everything between us forever. He was weak, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed just hours earlier, but his eyes were as calculating as ever. "It was an accident, Annie," he whispered, his hand reaching for mine. "I must have gotten confused with the medications. You know how forgetful I've been lately." Even facing the consequences of his actions, he was still trying to manipulate me, still attempting to rewrite history to protect himself. But I was done being manipulated. "I know what you did, Joe. I know about the sleeping pills, the muscle relaxants. I know about the money you've stolen from our accounts. I know everything." My voice was calm, steady, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the precision of a teacher correcting a stubborn student. His facade crumbled like a house of cards. The mask of confused elderly husband fell away, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "You can't prove anything," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Who's going to believe you? You're the one with memory problems. You're the one who's been acting confused and forgetful. Everyone will think you're having some kind of breakdown." But I wasn't the same woman who'd crawled across the kitchen floor in pain, calling for help that never came. I wasn't the same woman who'd accepted his version of reality for so many years. "We'll see about that," I said, and for the first time in decades, I saw fear flicker in my husband's eyes. The next few days were a whirlwind of difficult conversations and painful revelations. I contacted our family doctor and requested blood tests to confirm the presence of medications in my system. I met with a lawyer at the legal aid clinic in Harlem, a sharp young woman named Maria who specialized in elder abuse cases. I gathered every piece of financial documentation I could find, building a case that painted a clear picture of systematic theft and manipulation. Sarah's reaction when I called her was predictable and heartbreaking. "Mom, you're being paranoid. Dad would never hurt you. This is all some misunderstanding that's gotten out of hand." She couldn't or wouldn't accept that her father had been systematically abusing me, that the man she'd idolized was capable of such calculated cruelty. But Sarah's denial couldn't erase the evidence. The blood tests confirmed the presence of unprescribed medications in my system. The bank records showed a pattern of unauthorized transfers and withdrawals. The collection letters proved that Joe had been hiding our financial situation while continuing to drain our resources. My neighbor Margie Chen, the violinist I'd been listening to for years without really knowing, became my unexpected ally during those dark days. She'd noticed changes in my behavior over the past months, the way I'd seemed more confused and withdrawn, the way I'd stopped taking my daily walks to the bodega on Columbus Avenue. I wondered if something was wrong, she admitted over tea in her apartment, which was identical to mine but somehow felt warmer and more alive. But I didn't want to intrude. I should have said something sooner. Her genuine concern was like water to someone dying of thirst, a reminder that kindness still existed in the world. Margie helped me research elder abuse resources and accompanied me to my meetings with lawyers and social workers. She was the witness I needed, the outside observer who could corroborate that I wasn't losing my mind or making up stories. Her friendship became the foundation I needed to rebuild my shattered sense of reality. The confrontation with Joe when he was released from the hospital was inevitable and terrible. He arrived back at our apartment expecting everything to return to normal, expecting me to resume the role of the confused, dependent wife who needed his guidance and protection. Instead, he found me waiting in our living room with Margie beside me for support. Legal documents spread across our coffee table like evidence at a trial. I'd spent days preparing for this moment, gathering my courage and choosing my words carefully. "Sit down, Joe," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We need to talk about what happens next." His expression shifted from confusion to anger as he realized the balance of power had fundamentally changed. "Annie, what's all this nonsense? I'm tired. I want to go to bed." He moved toward our bedroom, but I blocked his path, my small frame suddenly feeling powerful and unmovable. "You're not sleeping in our bed tonight. You're not sleeping in this apartment tonight." The words came out clear and strong, each syllable backed by months of suppressed rage and years of accumulated pain. "I know what you did to me. I know about the drugs, the money, all of it." What followed was the most difficult hour of my life. Joe cycled through denial, anger, bargaining, and manipulation with the skill of a master practitioner. He accused me of having an affair with Margie. He claimed I was having a nervous breakdown. He threatened to have me committed to a psychiatric facility. He promised to change, to get help, to make everything right if I'd just give him another chance. But I'd made my decision during those long days in the hospital waiting room. watching my husband recover from his own poison. I'd chosen myself for the first time in 50 years, and no amount of manipulation could change that. I'm filing for divorce, Joe. I'm pressing charges for elder abuse and theft. You have until the end of the week to find somewhere else to live. The words felt surreal as they left my mouth, like I was watching someone else's life unfold on a movie screen. His rage was immediate and frightening. He swept the legal documents off the coffee table, screaming about ungrateful wives and wasted years. He accused me of planning this for months, of orchestrating his hospitalization as part of some elaborate scheme. The man I'd loved for 5 decades revealed himself completely in that moment, stripped of all pretense and charm. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Margie's presence beside me was a reminder that I wasn't alone, and the legal protections I'd put in place were like armor around my heart. Joe could rage and threaten, but he couldn't touch me anymore. The next morning, after a sleepless night on our couch, Joe was gone. He'd packed a single suitcase and left without a word, taking only his personal belongings and leaving behind 50 years of shared history, like it meant nothing at all. The silence in our apartment was deafening at first. After decades of Joe's constant presence, his opinions and demands and manipulations, the emptiness felt both liberating and terrifying. I wandered from room to room, touching familiar objects that seemed different somehow, transformed by the absence of his controlling energy. I found myself standing in front of our bedroom mirror, the same mirror that had reflected so many versions of myself over the years. The young bride, radiant with hope and love. The new mother, exhausted, but fierce with protective instinct. The middle-aged teacher, confident and capable in her professional life, while slowly disappearing in her personal one. The elderly wife, confused and diminished, accepting abuse as the price of companionship. But the woman looking back at me now was someone new. Her hair was still gray, her face still lined with age and worry, but her eyes held a strength I hadn't seen in years. She looked tired but triumphant, wounded but not broken. She looked like a survivor. The first few weeks were the hardest. Despite everything Joe had done, despite the evidence of his systematic abuse, part of me mourned the loss of our marriage. 50 years was a long time to share with someone, even someone who'd been slowly destroying me. The familiar rhythms of our daily life had been my prison, but they'd also been my routine, my sense of purpose and identity. I had to learn how to be alone without being lonely, how to make decisions without second-guessing every choice, how to trust my own perceptions after years of being told they were wrong. Some days I felt strong and independent, proud of my courage in standing up to Joe and reclaiming my life. Other days I felt lost and afraid, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake in destroying the only life I'd ever known. But gradually, slowly, I began to discover who I was when I wasn't defined by someone else's needs and demands. I started taking those walks in Central Park I'd suggested so many times to Joe, discovering hidden paths and quiet corners I'd never noticed before. I joined a book club at the local library, engaging in discussions about literature and ideas with people who valued my opinions and insights. Most importantly, I began the process of rebuilding my financial security with Maria's help. The legal proceedings against Joe were complex and slow, but we'd documented enough evidence to pursue both criminal charges and civil recovery. Some of the money he'd stolen would never be recovered, but I was learning to live within my means and find contentment in simple pleasures. The discovery that changed everything came 3 months after Joe left, when I was cleaning out his desk drawers more thoroughly. Hidden in a false bottom I almost missed was a folder containing documents that made my blood run cold. Bank statements for accounts I'd never known existed, showing regular deposits from our joint savings that had been accumulating for years. Investment portfolios worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, money that should have been paying for our medical expenses and daily living costs. Joe hadn't just been stealing from me to pay debts or fund some secret addiction. He'd been systematically transferring our assets to hidden accounts, building a vast fortune while letting me believe we were struggling financially. The man who'd convinced me we couldn't afford birthday celebrations or vacation trips had been accumulating wealth that could have funded a luxury retirement for both of us. There was so much money involved that part of it was even held in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency investments, modern financial instruments I barely understood, but that had apparently generated enormous profits. Their wealth in dollars seemed endless, spread across multiple investment accounts and even some stock market holdings that had performed incredibly well over the past few years. The most devastating discovery was a handwritten note in Joe's familiar scrawl, dated just 2 months before his hospitalization. Annie becoming too suspicious. Need to increase dosage gradually. Memory problems getting worse, which is good. Should be completely manageable within 6 months. Then can proceed with final transfer to offshore accounts. My husband hadn't just been drugging me to keep me compliant. He'd been planning to escalate the abuse until I was completely incapacitated, unable to function independently or make my own decisions. Once I was declared mentally incompetent, he would have had complete control over our assets and could have transferred everything to accounts I'd never be able to access or even know existed. The note was like a roadmap to my planned destruction, written in the hand of the man I'd shared a bed with for half a century. It revealed a level of premeditation and callousness that shook me to my core. This wasn't a crime of passion or a mistake made in desperation. It was a carefully calculated plan to systematically destroy my mind and steal my life's work. I sat in that apartment for hours, holding that note and trying to process the full scope of what had almost happened to me. If I hadn't switched those glasses, if I hadn't made that one small act of rebellion, I would have continued deteriorating until I was nothing more than a shell of my former self. Joe would have had me declared incompetent, possibly even committed to a facility where I would have spent my final years confused and helpless while he enjoyed the fruits of 5 decades of my labor. The legal implications were staggering. Maria explained that the evidence we'd uncovered elevated the case from simple elder abuse to attempted murder and grand theft on a massive scale. The systematic drugging with intent to incapacitate, the financial fraud, the hidden assets, all of it painted a picture of criminal behavior that could result in significant prison time for Joe. But more than the legal vindication, the discovery gave me something I'd been struggling to find since that terrible night: complete clarity about my decision to leave. There was no room for doubt anymore, no lingering guilt about destroying our marriage or breaking up our family. Joe hadn't just been a neglectful or controlling husband. He'd been a predator, systematically grooming me for complete exploitation. The conversation with Sarah when I shared this new evidence was one of the most painful experiences of my life. I'd hoped that concrete proof of her father's intentions would help her understand why I'd taken such drastic action, why I couldn't just forgive and forget and work things out like she'd been urging me to do. Instead, she became defensive and angry, accusing me of fabricating evidence or misunderstanding what the documents meant. Dad made some mistakes with money, Mom, but he would never deliberately hurt you. This is all some misunderstanding blown out of proportion by lawyers who want to make money off our family's problems. Her denial was so complete, so impermeable to facts and evidence, that I realized she'd been manipulated by Joe just as thoroughly as I had been. For years, he'd been cultivating her loyalty and affection while poisoning her perception of me, probably describing me as difficult and unreliable, prone to exaggeration and confusion. The final confrontation came when Joe showed up at our apartment unannounced, using his key before I could have the locks changed. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard the door open, and for a moment I was transported back to all those evenings when I'd waited nervously for his arrival, hoping his mood would be good, hoping I'd done nothing to disappoint him. But I wasn't that woman anymore. When Joe walked into the kitchen expecting to find his confused, dependent wife, he found someone completely different. I was standing at the stove stirring a pot of soup, my posture straight and confident, my eyes clear and focused. The transformation in my appearance was dramatic enough that he actually stopped in the doorway, as if he wasn't sure he'd entered the right apartment. "Hello, Joe," I said calmly, not turning around to face him. "You're trespassing. I've changed the locks, so whatever key you used won't work anymore." My voice was steady, conversational, as if I were commenting on the weather rather than addressing the man who'd nearly destroyed my life. He tried his old tactics immediately, shifting into the concerned husband routine that had worked so well for so many years. "Annie, sweetheart, we need to talk about this misunderstanding. I've been staying with Frank, but I miss you. I miss us. Maybe we can work something out. Get some counseling. Figure out how to fix what went wrong." I finally turned to face him, and I could see the shock in his eyes as he took in my appearance. I'd started taking better care of myself since he'd left, eating regular meals, sleeping through the night without drugs clouding my system, taking walks that brought color back to my cheeks. I looked healthier and stronger than I had in months, and the contrast must have been jarring for someone who'd been systematically weakening me for so long. "There's nothing to work out, Joe. I know about the hidden accounts. I know about the offshore transfers. I know about your plan to have me declared incompetent so you could steal everything I've worked for my entire life." I reached into a kitchen drawer and pulled out copies of the documents Maria and I had discovered, spreading them on the counter between us like a barrier made of truth. His mask slipped completely in that moment. The concerned husband disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating that I'd glimpsed in fleeting moments over the years but had never fully recognized. This was who Joe really was beneath the charm and manipulation, a predator who'd spent decades perfecting his technique on the woman who trusted him most. "You can't prove any of this means what you think it means," he said, his voice taking on a threatening edge I'd never heard before. "You're a confused old woman who's being manipulated by lawyers and busybody neighbors who don't understand our marriage. No court is going to believe your paranoid fantasies over 50 years of marriage and commitment." But I wasn't afraid of him anymore. The woman who'd cowered on the kitchen floor for 2 days, calling for help that never came, was gone. In her place stood someone who'd survived attempted murder and systematic abuse. Someone who'd found the courage to fight back against impossible odds. "Actually, Joe, they already believe me. The district attorney's office is very interested in your creative approach to retirement planning. Attempted murder tends to get their attention." I reached for my phone with deliberate calm. "You have 30 seconds to leave this apartment before I call the police. And if you ever use your key to enter my home again, I'll have you arrested for breaking and entering." What happened next revealed the true depth of Joe's desperation and rage. He lunged toward the counter where the documents were spread, trying to gather them up and destroy the evidence. But I was ready for him. Stepping back while keeping my phone raised, my finger poised over the emergency call button. "That won't help you, Joe. These are copies. Maria has the originals locked in a safe at her office. The FBI has copies of the financial records. Your secret accounts have been frozen by court order. It's over." The words came out with a finality that surprised even me. Each syllable weighted with the authority of someone who'd reclaimed her power after years of giving it away. He stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his face flushed with an anger that made him look like a stranger. This was the man I'd shared my bed with, bore children with, trusted with my life and future. But I could see now that he'd been performing the role of loving husband while planning my destruction with cold precision. "You'll regret this, Annie. You think you're so smart now, but you have no idea how to survive without me. You'll come crawling back within a month, begging me to take care of you again." He was gathering steam, his voice rising with the kind of rage I'd seen him direct at other people, but never at me directly. I walked to the front door and opened it wide, standing beside it like a sentry waiting to escort an unwelcome visitor from the premises. "Goodbye, Joe. Don't come back." The simplicity of my response seemed to deflate his anger, as if he'd been expecting me to engage in the kind of dramatic argument that would give him more ammunition for manipulation. He left without another word, his shoulders hunched with defeat, carrying himself like the old man he'd become while I wasn't paying attention. I watched him walk down the hallway toward the elevator. This person who'd shared my life for 50 years but had never really known me at all. After the door closed behind him, I turned the deadbolt with a click that sounded like freedom itself. The apartment was mine now, truly mine for the first time in decades. No one was monitoring my movements or questioning my decisions. No one was drugging my water or stealing my money or planning my destruction. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely anymore. The woman in the mirror that night looked different again. Stronger, more complete. The fear that had lived in her eyes for so long was gone, replaced by something I'd almost forgotten: self-respect. She looked like someone who'd fought a war and won, someone who'd discovered reserves of courage she never knew she possessed. The legal proceedings took almost a year to fully resolve, but the outcome exceeded even Maria's optimistic predictions. Joe pleaded guilty to elder abuse, fraud, and attempted poisoning in exchange for a sentence that would keep him in prison for the next 8 years. The hidden assets were recovered and returned to me, minus legal fees and court costs, but still representing more money than I'd ever imagined we possessed. Sarah's reaction to her father's conviction was complicated and painful. She attended the sentencing hearing, but couldn't bring herself to speak to me. Torn between loyalty to the father she'd idolized and the evidence that he'd systematically abused her mother for years. I held out hope that someday we'd be able to rebuild our relationship, but I'd learned to find peace with things I couldn't control or change. The most surprising development was my friendship with Margie Chen, which had deepened into something I'd never experienced before. A relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation or need. She'd shown me what healthy companionship looked like, how two people could support each other without one person sacrificing their identity for the other's comfort. With my financial security restored, I was able to make choices I'd never dreamed possible. I moved to a brighter apartment on the Upper East Side, closer to Central Park, and the museums I'd always loved but rarely had time to visit. I started taking art classes at a community center, discovering a talent for watercolor painting that had been dormant for decades. Most importantly, I began traveling, not the rushed, packaged tours Joe had always dismissed as wasteful, but slow, meaningful journeys to places I'd dreamed about since childhood. I spent a month in Tuscany, painting landscapes and learning to make pasta from elderly Italian women who reminded me of myself. I visited Ireland and walked the cliffs my grandmother had described in stories, feeling connected to a heritage Joe had always considered irrelevant. Each trip was a declaration of independence, a celebration of the life I'd reclaimed from someone who'd tried to steal it from me. The woman who boarded those planes bore little resemblance to the frightened, confused person who'd switched 2 glasses of water on a desperate gamble almost 2 years earlier. The most profound change wasn't in my circumstances, but in my relationship with myself. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for my own happiness rather than someone else's approval. I could eat what I wanted when I wanted, watch television programs that interested me, spend money on things that brought me joy, and make decisions based on my own values and desires rather than fear of disappointing someone else. I started writing in a journal, recording my thoughts and experiences with the same care I'd once put into lesson plans for my 3rd-grade students. The process of putting my story into words helped me understand how I'd survived such systematic abuse, how I'd found the strength to fight back when everything inside me had been conditioned to submit and endure. The answer, I discovered, was that Joe had never succeeded in completely erasing the person I'd been before I met him. Somewhere deep inside, the young woman who'd graduated from teacher's college with dreams and ambitions had been waiting, dormant, but not dead, for the chance to reemerge. The courage I'd displayed in that final confrontation hadn't come from nowhere. It had been building slowly throughout years of small acts of quiet resistance, moments when I'd chosen to trust my own perceptions despite his gaslighting, times when I'd helped my students while neglecting myself but still maintained some connection to my professional identity and competence. The water glass incident, as I came to think of it, wasn't really about the sleeping pills or the financial fraud. though those things were certainly important. It was about the moment I chose to trust my instincts over my conditioning, to take action despite my fear, to value my own safety and dignity more than the illusion of security that had kept me trapped for so long. Looking back now, I can see that Joe's greatest mistake was underestimating me. He'd become so confident in his ability to control and manipulate that he'd grown careless, leaving evidence where I could find it, pushing the abuse to levels that finally broke through my programmed compliance. If he'd been more subtle, more patient, he might have succeeded in his plan to gradually destroy my mental faculties while systematically stealing everything I'd worked for. But predators, I've learned, often contain the seeds of their own destruction. Their need for complete control eventually drives them to take risks and make mistakes that reveal their true nature. Joe's greed and impatience led him to escalate too quickly, to leave too many traces of his criminal behavior, to push me to a breaking point that ultimately saved my life. The most difficult aspect of my recovery wasn't dealing with the legal system or managing my finances or even learning to live alone. It was untangling 50 years of programming that had taught me to doubt my own perceptions, to prioritize everyone else's comfort over my own well-being, to accept mistreatment as the price of companionship. I had to relearn basic skills I'd forgotten I possessed: how to make decisions without seeking permission, how to spend money on myself without guilt, how to trust my own judgment about people and situations. I had to recognize the difference between healthy compromise and unhealthy submission, between loving support and controlling manipulation. The process was slow and sometimes painful, like rehabilitation after a severe injury. There were days when I missed the familiar routines of my old life, even though I knew they'd been slowly killing me. There were nights when I woke up panicked, forgetting for a moment that I was safe and free, expecting to find Joe beside me with his carefully prepared glass of poisoned water. But gradually, the new patterns became natural. I learned to enjoy my morning coffee without worrying about someone else's mood. I discovered the pleasure of choosing what to watch on television, what books to read, what clothes to wear based entirely on my own preferences. I found joy in simple activities, feeding pigeons in the park, chatting with shopkeepers who began to recognize me as a regular customer, attending concerts and lectures without having to negotiate or justify my interests. The surprising thing was how much energy I had once I was no longer being systematically poisoned and psychologically manipulated. The fog that had clouded my thinking for months lifted completely, revealing a mind that was still sharp and curious and capable of learning new things. My body recovered from the effects of the drugs, and I found myself feeling more physically strong and coordinated than I had in years. I started volunteering at a literacy program for elderly immigrants, helping people my age learn to read English so they could navigate American society more independently. The work connected me to my teaching roots while introducing me to communities and cultures I'd never encountered during my sheltered married life. My students' courage in starting over in a new country at advanced ages inspired me to embrace my own fresh beginning with more enthusiasm and less fear. One of my students, a 78-year-old woman named Rosa, who'd emigrated from Guatemala to live with her grandchildren, reminded me powerfully of my own journey. She'd spent her entire life caring for others, first as a daughter, then as a wife and mother, then as a grandmother, without ever learning to read because there'd never been time for her own education. I always thought it was too late for me to learn new things, she told me during one of our sessions, her weathered hands carefully forming letters on the practice sheets I'd prepared. But my granddaughter, she'd tell me I'm still here, I'm still breathing, so maybe it's not too late for anything. Her words stayed with me for days afterward, resonating with something deep in my own experience. I was still here, still breathing, still capable of learning and growing and changing in ways I'd never imagined possible. The life I'd thought was ending when I reached my 70s was actually just beginning, freed from the constraints and limitations that had defined my existence for so long. The revelation that perhaps startled me most was discovering how many other women my age were living similar stories of quiet desperation and systematic abuse. Through the support group Maria had recommended, I met elderly wives whose husbands controlled every aspect of their lives, widows whose children were systematically draining their inheritance, mothers whose adult offspring used emotional blackmail to extract money and free labor while giving nothing in return. The stories were heartbreakingly similar. Decades of self-sacrifice and service rewarded with neglect, manipulation, and exploitation. Women who'd worked their entire lives to support their families, only to find themselves financially and emotionally abandoned when they needed care and support themselves. The epidemic of elder abuse was vast and largely invisible, hidden behind closed doors and family loyalty and societal assumptions about aging and dependency. But I also met survivors, women who'd found the courage to break free from abusive relationships, who'd reclaimed their autonomy and dignity after years of oppression, who were thriving in their independence despite starting over in their 70s and 80s. Their stories gave me hope and inspiration during the darkest moments of my own recovery. One woman, Betty, had left her emotionally abusive husband of 45 years after he'd pushed her down the stairs during an argument. Another, Carmen, had cut ties with adult children who'd been stealing her pension checks while refusing to help with her medical needs. A third, Eleanor, had moved across the country to escape a family that treated her like a combination of unpaid servant and automatic teller machine. All of them had faced the same fears I'd struggled with: the terror of being alone, the guilt of breaking up the family, the practical challenges of managing independently after decades of learned helplessness. All of them had discovered, as I was discovering, that the worst loneliness was being with people who didn't truly see or value you. That the most devastating poverty was having your life's work stolen by those who claimed to love you. Their friendship and support were invaluable during the legal proceedings against Joe, when the stress of testimony and cross-examination and media attention sometimes threatened to overwhelm my resolve. Having other women who understood exactly what I'd experienced, who could validate my perceptions when Joe's lawyers tried to paint me as confused and vindictive, made the difference between surviving the process and being destroyed by it. The day of Joe's sentencing was one I'd both anticipated and dreaded for months. Standing in that courtroom, facing the man who'd shared my bed and my life for 50 years while planning my systematic destruction, I felt a complex mixture of emotions I still struggle to untangle. There was anger, certainly, and satisfaction that justice was finally being served. But there was also sadness for the years we'd lost, the love that had been real once upon a time before it was corrupted by his need for control and dominance. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I'd prepared carefully, knowing this might be my only opportunity to speak directly to Joe about what he'd done to me and to our family. I stood at the podium in that formal courtroom, surrounded by lawyers and clerks and observers, and found my voice stronger and clearer than it had been in years. "Your Honor," I began, looking directly at Joe for the first time since that confrontation in our kitchen. The man sitting at the defendant's table was my husband for 50 years. I loved him, trusted him, sacrificed for him, and built my life around making him happy. In return, he systematically stole my money, poisoned my body, and tried to destroy my mind so he could have complete control over everything I'd worked for my entire life. Joe wouldn't meet my eyes as I spoke. His head bowed as if in shame, though I suspected it was more likely calculation about how to present himself as a sympathetic figure who'd made mistakes rather than committed deliberate crimes. The physical abuse was terrible, but the psychological damage was worse. He made me doubt my own perceptions, question my own memories, accept his version of reality, even when it contradicted the evidence of my own eyes. He convinced me I was losing my mind while he was the one systematically destroying my mental clarity with drugs I didn't know I was taking. My voice remained steady throughout the statement, each word carefully chosen to convey not just the facts of what had happened, but the emotional devastation of betrayal by the person who should have been my greatest protector and advocate. I want the court to understand that this wasn't a crime of passion or a mistake made in desperate circumstances. This was a carefully planned campaign of abuse that lasted for months, possibly years, with the explicit goal of incapacitating me so completely that I would be unable to protect myself or my assets from his theft. If I hadn't accidentally discovered what he was doing, I would probably be institutionalized now, declared incompetent and unable to care for myself, while he enjoyed the fruits of my life's work. I concluded by addressing Joe directly, though he still wouldn't look at me. You nearly succeeded in destroying me, but you failed. I'm stronger now than I've ever been, and I've built a life for myself that brings me joy and purpose, and the kind of genuine love you were never capable of giving. Your betrayal freed me from a prison I didn't even know I was in, and for that, I suppose I should thank you. The courtroom was completely silent when I finished speaking. Even Joe's lawyer seemed subdued, perhaps finally understanding the full scope of what his client had attempted to do to a woman who'd devoted half a century to making him happy. Joe received 8 years in prison, which would make him 83 when he was released, if he lived that long. The sentence felt both too lenient and appropriately severe. No amount of prison time could restore the years I'd lost or repair the damage to our family relationships. But it served as recognition that what he'd done to me was criminal, not just morally wrong. More importantly, it sent a message that elder abuse wouldn't be tolerated, that older women like me had rights and dignity that deserved protection under the law. Maria told me later that our case had helped establish precedents that would make it easier to prosecute similar crimes in the future, that my willingness to come forward might help other women in comparable situations. The media attention was both gratifying and uncomfortable. My story became a cautionary tale about elder abuse, featured in newspaper articles and television segments about the warning signs family members should watch for and resources available to victims. I received hundreds of letters from women sharing their own experiences of abuse and exploitation, some of whom had been inspired by my example to seek help for their own situations. But the public attention also brought criticism and judgment from people who couldn't understand why I'd stayed in an abusive relationship for so long, why I hadn't recognized the warning signs earlier, why I'd allowed myself to be victimized. The victim blaming was painful but not unexpected. Society still struggles to understand how systematic psychological manipulation works, how gradually and subtly abusers erode their victims' ability to recognize and resist their tactics. I tried to use the media opportunities to educate people about the realities of elder abuse, to explain how someone could be systematically drugged and financially exploited without realizing what was happening. The key point I emphasized was that abusers don't start with extreme behavior. They begin with small boundary violations and escalate so gradually that their victims adapt and normalize each new level of mistreatment. The most rewarding aspect of sharing my story publicly was connecting with other survivors and advocates, people working to reform laws and support systems to better protect elderly people from exploitation and abuse. I began speaking at conferences and training sessions for social workers, nurses, and law enforcement officers, helping them understand what to look for and how to approach victims who might not recognize themselves as such. This advocacy work gave new meaning and purpose to my retirement years, transforming my painful experience into something that could potentially help others avoid similar victimization. Instead of spending my 70s in confused decline as Joe had planned, I was traveling the country sharing my story and expertise, contributing to policy discussions and research studies about elder abuse prevention and intervention. The irony wasn't lost on me that Joe's attempt to destroy my independence and agency had ultimately led to a level of autonomy and influence I'd never experienced during our marriage. His betrayal had freed me not just from his control, but from the limitations I'd accepted as natural and inevitable parts of being an elderly woman. 2 years after that terrible night when I switched our water glasses, I was living a life I couldn't have imagined when I was shuffling around our dim apartment, waiting for Joe to emerge from his recliner and tell me what to do next. I had my own apartment filled with light and plants and artwork I'd chosen because it spoke to me. I had genuine friendships with people who valued my opinions and enjoyed my company without needing anything from me in return. Most surprisingly, I had begun dating again, something I'd never thought would be possible or appropriate at my age. Through the literacy program where I volunteered, I met Robert, a retired librarian whose wife had died 3 years earlier after a long battle with Alzheimer's. He was kind and gentle and respectful in ways that highlighted just how abnormal Joe's behavior had actually been. Robert asked permission to hold my hand. He listened when I spoke and remembered details from previous conversations. He paid for his own meals when we went to dinner and never expected me to take care of him or solve his problems. The contrast with my marriage was so stark, it sometimes made me weep for all the years I'd wasted accepting so much less than I deserved. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, with both of us sensitive to the ways our previous partnerships had shaped our expectations and fears. I was learning to recognize the difference between healthy interdependence and unhealthy codependence, between compromise and capitulation, between love and manipulation, disguised as concern. Robert knew about my history with Joe and the legal proceedings, but he treated me as a strong, capable woman who'd survived a terrible ordeal rather than a damaged victim who needed rescuing. His respect for my autonomy and his genuine interest in my thoughts and experiences were healing in ways I was still discovering. The relationship also helped me understand that my capacity for love and trust hadn't been permanently damaged by Joe's betrayal. I could still open my heart to another person without losing myself in the process. I could still believe in the possibility of genuine partnership between equals who chose to share their lives while maintaining their individual identities and independence. Sarah called me for the first time in over a year on my 76th birthday, tentatively reaching out after the media coverage of Joe's conviction had forced her to confront the reality of what her father had done to me. The conversation was awkward and painful, full of long silences and careful words, but it was a beginning. She was seeing a therapist, she told me, trying to understand how she'd been manipulated into enabling her father's abuse, how her loyalty to him had blinded her to my suffering. The process was difficult and sometimes overwhelming, she admitted, but she was committed to rebuilding our relationship if I was willing to try. I was willing, though I insisted on conditions. We would need family counseling to work through the dynamics that had allowed Joe to turn us against each other. She would need to accept that I was no longer the compliant, self-sacrificing mother she remembered, that I had boundaries and expectations that would be respected. Most importantly, she would need to acknowledge the full reality of what her father had done to me, not minimize it or rationalize it or treat it as a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with forgiveness and family loyalty. The process of repairing our relationship was slow and sometimes frustrating, but gradually we began to see each other as real people rather than the roles we'd been assigned in the dysfunctional family system Joe had created. Sarah began to understand how her father had manipulated her perceptions of me, convinced her that my complaints about his behavior were signs of age-related confusion rather than legitimate concerns about abuse. I began to see how Sarah had been as much a victim of Joe's manipulation as I had been, though in different ways. He'd cultivated her loyalty and affection while systematically undermining her relationship with me, creating a dynamic where she felt she had to choose between us, rather than recognizing that her mother was being abused and needed her support. Our family therapy sessions were sometimes emotionally brutal, forcing us to examine years of misunderstanding and hurt feelings and missed opportunities for connection. But they were also healing, clearing away the debris of Joe's manipulation and allowing us to rediscover the love that had always existed underneath the dysfunction. My grandchildren, now adults with their own families, were initially confused and skeptical about the changes in family dynamics. They'd grown up seeing their grandfather as a charming, generous man who occasionally clashed with their demanding, difficult grandmother, learning that their perception had been carefully crafted through years of manipulation and gaslighting was disorienting and upsetting. But young people, I discovered, are often more adaptable than their parents when it comes to accepting new information and changing their perspectives. Once they understood what had really been happening in our household, they were quick to offer support and apologies for not recognizing the signs earlier. The relationship with my grandchildren became one of the most rewarding aspects of my new life. Without Joe's interference and manipulation, I was free to develop genuine connections with them based on shared interests and authentic affection rather than obligation and guilt. They were fascinated by the story of my transformation and inspired by the courage I'd shown in rebuilding my life in my 70s. My oldest granddaughter, Emma, even chose to write her college senior thesis about elder abuse, using my case as a primary example of how systematic psychological manipulation can be used to facilitate financial exploitation. Her research contributed to greater awareness of the issue among her generation, who might someday be in a position to protect their own grandparents from similar victimization. The ripple effects of my decision to fight back against Joe's abuse extended far beyond my personal situation. The legal precedents established by our case made it easier for other victims to seek justice. The media attention raised public awareness about elder abuse in ways that likely prevented other crimes. The educational work I'd begun reached thousands of people who might now be better equipped to recognize and report suspicious behavior. But perhaps most importantly, my story provided hope and inspiration to other elderly women who felt trapped in abusive relationships, who believed it was too late to start over, who'd been convinced they were too old or too damaged or too dependent to survive on their own. The letters I continued to receive from women across the country were testament to the impact of choosing courage over comfort, dignity over security, truth over the illusion of peace. Many of them described taking their own first steps toward freedom, encouraged by the example of a 74-year-old woman who'd found the strength to say no to 50 years of conditioning and manipulation. Looking back now, nearly 3 years after that pivotal night when I switched our water glasses, I can see how every element of my life has been transformed. The apartment where I live is bright and welcoming, filled with artwork and books and photographs that reflect my own tastes and interests rather than someone else's preferences. The clothes in my closet are colorful and comfortable, chosen because they make me feel good about myself rather than invisible and unnoticed. My days are filled with activities that bring me joy and purpose, painting watercolors of Central Park scenes, tutoring immigrant women at the Literacy Center, speaking at conferences about elder abuse prevention, traveling to places I've always wanted to see but never had the freedom to visit. I have genuine friendships with people who value my company and seek my advice, romantic companionship with someone who treats me as an equal partner, and a renewed relationship with my daughter and grandchildren based on mutual respect rather than duty and guilt. Most profoundly, I have a relationship with myself that I never had during my marriage. I know what I like and dislike, what I value and what I won't tolerate, what brings me happiness and what drains my energy. I trust my own perceptions and judgment in ways that Joe spent decades undermining. I make decisions based on my own needs and desires, rather than fear of disappointing or angering someone else. The financial security Joe tried to steal from me has been restored, and then some. The investments he'd hidden away in secret accounts had grown substantially during the years he was planning my destruction, meaning I emerged from the legal proceedings significantly wealthier than I'd been before the abuse began. The irony of benefiting financially from his attempted theft wasn't lost on me, though the money paled in comparison to the personal freedom and dignity I'd reclaimed. I used part of the recovered funds to establish a foundation providing legal assistance to elderly abuse victims who couldn't afford quality representation. The Ann Morrison Foundation has already helped dozens of women escape situations similar to mine, and the work continues to expand as awareness of elder abuse grows and more victims find the courage to come forward. The foundation also funds research into the long-term effects of systematic psychological manipulation in elderly populations, contributing to better understanding of how abusers operate and how their victims can be most effectively supported. The goal is not just to help individual victims, but to prevent future victimization through education, early intervention, and systemic changes to how society recognizes and responds to elder abuse. Sometimes I'm asked whether I regret the years I spent with Joe, whether I wish I'd recognized his true nature earlier, and left him decades ago when I was younger and had more options. The question is complicated because those 50 years weren't entirely negative. There were good times, genuine love, shared experiences that contributed to making me who I am today. But I don't waste time on regret anymore. The past can't be changed, only understood and integrated into a fuller picture of my life's journey. Those difficult years taught me resilience and empathy and strength I didn't know I possessed. They prepared me, in ways I couldn't have anticipated, for the work I'm doing now to help other women avoid or escape similar situations. More importantly, focusing on regret would steal energy and attention from the life I'm living now. The opportunities and relationships and experiences that continue to unfold in ways that surprise and delight me. At 77, I'm busier and more engaged with the world than I was at 57, when my existence revolved around managing Joe's moods and needs and keeping our household functioning according to his specifications. The woman I've become is someone I genuinely like and respect, someone whose company I enjoy even when I'm alone. She's curious and adventurous and willing to try new things despite the risk of failure or embarrassment. She stands up for herself and others, speaks her truth even when it's uncomfortable, and refuses to settle for less than she deserves in any relationship or situation. She's also someone who understands the difference between being alone and being lonely, between solitude and isolation. The quiet evenings in my apartment are peaceful rather than empty, filled with books and music and creative projects that nourish my soul, rather than television programs that numb my mind. The independence I was so afraid of losing has become my most treasured possession. The transformation hasn't been without challenges and setbacks. There were days during the legal proceedings when the stress and emotional turmoil made me question whether I'd made the right decision in confronting Joe and destroying our marriage. There were nights when I woke up panicked, my body remembering decades of hypervigilance and fear even though my rational mind knew I was safe. Learning to trust my own judgment after years of having my perceptions systematically undermined was perhaps the most difficult aspect of recovery. I had to relearn how to make decisions without second-guessing myself, how to respond to my own emotions without filtering them through someone else's potential reactions, how to take up space in the world without apologizing for my existence. But each challenge overcome made me stronger and more confident in my ability to handle whatever came next. The woman who'd been afraid to say no to her husband's unreasonable demands became someone capable of standing up to lawyers and judges and reporters, someone whose voice carried authority and conviction when she spoke about issues that mattered to her. The physical transformation was as dramatic as the emotional and psychological changes. The chronic fatigue and confusion that had plagued me during the months when Joe was drugging my water disappeared completely once the substances left my system. My arthritis symptoms improved significantly when I was no longer under constant stress and psychological pressure. Even my posture changed as I stopped unconsciously bracing myself against criticism and attack. I started exercising regularly for the first time in decades, joining a seniors fitness program at the local community center where I met other women my age who were focused on maintaining their health and independence. The physical strength I built translated into emotional resilience and mental clarity that supported every other aspect of my recovery. The process of rebuilding my relationship with my own body after years of having it systematically poisoned was both literal and metaphorical. I had to learn to trust its signals again, to honor its needs for rest and nutrition and movement, to see it as an ally rather than a burden or liability. The careful attention I began paying to how different foods and activities affected my energy and mood was part of a larger process of tuning into my own needs and preferences after decades of focusing exclusively on someone else's. Food, in particular, became a form of self-care and creative expression that I'd never experienced during my marriage. Joe had strong preferences about meals and expected me to cook according to his tastes and dietary restrictions, leaving little room for my own culinary interests or experiments. Now I could explore different cuisines, try new recipes, eat when I was hungry rather than according to someone else's schedule. The simple pleasure of choosing what to have for dinner each evening, without considering anyone else's preferences or restrictions, was emblematic of the larger freedom I'd reclaimed. Every decision, from major life choices to minor daily preferences, was mine to make based on my own values and desires, rather than fear of disapproval or retaliation. This autonomy extended to how I spent my time and energy, how I decorated my living space, what relationships I chose to maintain or develop, what activities and interests I pursued. After 50 years of negotiating and compromising and accommodating someone else's needs, the freedom to simply please myself was intoxicating and sometimes overwhelming. I had to learn moderation in exercising my newfound independence, to distinguish between healthy self-assertion and reactive overcorrection. There were periods when I was so determined to never again be controlled or manipulated that I became suspicious of any request for help or accommodation, even from people who genuinely cared about me and had legitimate needs. The balance between maintaining my hard-won autonomy and remaining open to healthy interdependence was something I worked on extensively in therapy and through conversations with other survivors who'd navigated similar challenges. Learning to say yes to reasonable requests while firmly maintaining my right to say no to unreasonable ones was a crucial skill that took time and practice to develop. Robert was patient and understanding as I worked through these issues, never pressuring me to move faster or commit more deeply to our relationship than felt comfortable. His respect for my boundaries and his willingness to discuss and negotiate our expectations openly created a model of partnership that was completely different from anything I'd experienced with Joe. The contrast between the two relationships was so stark, it sometimes felt like I was living in a different universe. Where Joe had been controlling, Robert was supportive. Where Joe had been manipulative, Robert was straightforward. Where Joe had demanded compliance, Robert encouraged independence. Where Joe had seen my strength as a threat to be eliminated, Robert celebrated it as an asset to be cherished. Being with someone who genuinely wanted me to be happy and fulfilled, even when that sometimes meant making choices he didn't prefer, was a revelation that reshaped my understanding of what love could look like. Joe had convinced me that his possessiveness and control were evidence of how much he cared about me, that his demands for compliance were expressions of his love and concern for my well-being. Robert showed me that real love supports the other person's growth and independence, that healthy relationships make both people stronger and more complete, rather than diminished and dependent. The security I felt with him came not from his control over my choices, but from his consistent respect for my autonomy and dignity. This lesson extended beyond romantic relationships to every area of my life. I began to evaluate all my connections, with family members, friends, acquaintances, service providers, based on whether they treated me with genuine respect and care, or whether they were motivated by what they could get from me. The criteria for allowing people into my life became much more stringent, but also more authentic. I was no longer interested in maintaining relationships based on obligation or guilt or fear of being alone. I wanted connections that were mutually beneficial and genuinely affectionate, where both people contributed and both people received support and companionship. This shift in standards meant that some long-standing relationships ended or changed dramatically, but it also opened space for new connections that were healthier and more fulfilling. The quality of my social life improved exponentially, even as the quantity of relationships decreased, leaving me feeling more supported and understood than I had in decades. The work I began doing with the Elder Abuse Foundation put me in contact with advocates and activists and researchers from around the country, expanding my social and professional network in ways I couldn't have imagined when I was isolated in my apartment with Joe. These new relationships were based on shared values and common interests rather than proximity or family obligation, creating bonds that enriched my life immeasurably. Through this work, I also began traveling more extensively, something I'd dreamed of doing for decades but had never been able to pursue during my marriage. Joe's reluctance to travel, combined with our chronic financial constraints, had kept me anchored to New York City for most of my adult life. Now I had both the resources and the freedom to explore other places, both within the United States and internationally. Each trip was an adventure that would have been impossible during my marriage, not just because of Joe's objections, but because of the confidence and independence required to navigate unfamiliar places and situations. The woman who'd been afraid to make decisions without consulting her husband became someone comfortable traveling alone, making reservations, managing logistics, and adapting to unexpected challenges. The photographs from these trips tell the story of my transformation better than words ever could. In early pictures, taken during the first tentative journeys after Joe left, I look uncertain and somewhat overwhelmed, like someone who's not quite sure she belongs in the places she's visiting. In more recent images, I appear confident and engaged, someone clearly enjoying herself and comfortable in her own skin wherever she happens to be. The travel experiences also contributed to my personal growth in ways that went far beyond simple pleasure or cultural enrichment. Navigating foreign countries where I didn't speak the language, trying foods I'd never encountered, adapting to different customs and social norms. All of these challenges built resilience and flexibility that served me well in every area of my life. More importantly, seeing how women my age were treated and valued in different cultures gave me perspective on the assumptions and limitations I'd unconsciously accepted about aging and gender roles in American society. In some places, elderly women were revered as sources of wisdom and authority. In others, they played central roles in family and community decision-making that would have been unthinkable in my former life with Joe. These experiences reinforced my growing understanding that many of the constraints I'd experienced weren't inevitable aspects of aging, but rather culturally specific expectations that could be challenged and changed. The limitations Joe had imposed on me, justified as natural consequences of my gender and age, were revealed as arbitrary restrictions designed to serve his interests rather than protect my well-being. Coming back from these trips energized and inspired rather than exhausted and overwhelmed was perhaps the clearest evidence of how dramatically my life had changed. During my marriage, even small outings often left me drained and anxious because I was always worried about Joe's reaction to any deviation from our routine or any disruption to his comfort. Now I could travel for weeks at a time, dealing with flight delays and language barriers and unfamiliar customs, and return home feeling refreshed and stimulated rather than depleted. The energy I'd been pouring into managing Joe's moods and needs and demands was now available for my own growth and enjoyment, creating a positive feedback loop that continued to expand my horizons. The financial investigations that followed Joe's arrest revealed the full scope of his deception in ways that continued to shock me even after I thought I understood the extent of his betrayal. The hidden accounts contained not just our stolen savings but profits from investments I'd unknowingly been funding for years. His secret Bitcoin holdings had appreciated enormously, creating wealth that should have secured both our futures, but had been systematically hidden from me. The discovery that we'd actually been quite wealthy while I was clipping coupons and worrying about grocery bills was perhaps the most infuriating aspect of the entire ordeal. Joe had convinced me we were financially struggling while building a portfolio that could have funded a luxurious retirement for both of us. His manipulation had been so thorough that I'd been grateful for his careful money management, even as he was stealing everything I'd worked for. Recovering these assets provided me with financial security beyond anything I'd ever imagined possible, but it also highlighted the profound betrayal of trust that had characterized our entire marriage. Joe hadn't just been hiding money. He'd been actively deceiving me about our financial situation to maintain control and keep me dependent on his supposed expertise in managing our affairs. The psychological impact of learning that I could have been living comfortably for years, while instead worrying about every expense, was something I had to process with professional help. The realization that my financial anxiety had been manufactured and maintained by someone who claimed to love me was almost harder to accept than the physical drugging and emotional manipulation. It also raised questions about what else Joe might have been lying about throughout our marriage. What other aspects of our shared reality had been carefully constructed deceptions designed to serve his interests, rather than reflect actual circumstances? The process of examining 50 years of memories and assumptions was exhausting and sometimes painful, but it was necessary for my complete recovery. Working with forensic accountants and financial investigators to trace all the hidden assets and reconstruct the full picture of Joe's deceptions was like putting together a massive puzzle where half the pieces had been deliberately obscured. Each new discovery revealed another layer of premeditation and calculation that made his crimes even more horrifying. But it also revealed the extent of my own contributions to our financial security, work, and sacrifice that Joe had systematically minimized and appropriated for his own purposes. My teacher's pension, my careful budgeting and frugal lifestyle, my willingness to forego luxuries and experiences, all of these had contributed to building wealth that Joe had then stolen and hidden, while claiming credit for our supposed financial success. Seeing the actual numbers, understanding my own role in creating the financial foundation he'd exploited, was empowering in ways I hadn't expected. I wasn't a helpless victim who'd been preyed upon by a superior intellect. I was a competent, hardworking woman who'd been systematically deceived by someone who'd exploited my trust and loved to facilitate his crimes. This realization was crucial for rebuilding my self-confidence and sense of personal agency. Instead of seeing myself as someone who'd been foolish enough to be manipulated for 50 years, I could recognize that I'd been a target precisely because of my strengths, my loyalty, my work ethic, my financial responsibility, my commitment to our marriage and family. Joe had selected me as a victim not because I was weak or gullible, but because I was exactly the kind of person who would sacrifice her own interests for the sake of someone she loved, who would trust her husband's judgment even when it conflicted with her own perceptions, who would work tirelessly to support a partnership she believed was mutual. Understanding the calculated nature of his manipulation helped me forgive myself for not recognizing it sooner, for not fighting back more effectively, for allowing the abuse to continue for so long. I hadn't been stupid or complicit. I'd been targeted by someone skilled in psychological manipulation who'd spent decades perfecting his techniques. This perspective was crucial for my advocacy work with other elder abuse victims, many of whom struggled with shame and self-blame that prevented them from seeking help or fully recovering from their experiences. Being able to explain how abusers deliberately target strong, competent people and systematically undermine their confidence and judgment helped other survivors understand that their victimization wasn't evidence of personal weakness or failure. The speaking engagements and conference presentations I began doing required me to revisit my story repeatedly, each time finding new insights and connections that deepened my understanding of what had happened and why. The process of transformation was ongoing rather than complete, with new layers of healing and growth continuing to emerge years after the initial crisis. What surprised me most was how much I enjoyed the public speaking, despite having been shy and self-effacing for most of my adult life. The confidence I'd developed through surviving Joe's abuse and rebuilding my life translated into an ability to command attention and respect when I addressed audiences of professionals and advocates. The positive response to my presentations, the questions and comments from people who found my story helpful or inspiring, reinforced my sense that the terrible experience I'd endured had been transformed into something valuable that could benefit others. The meaning and purpose I'd found in advocacy work made the suffering feel less pointless, less purely destructive. I also discovered that I had natural teaching abilities that extended beyond the elementary classroom where I'd spent my career. The skills I'd used to help children learn and grow were equally effective when applied to adult education about abuse dynamics and prevention strategies. My background in education gave me credibility and expertise that enhanced my effectiveness as an advocate. The combination of personal experience and professional knowledge created a unique perspective that audiences found particularly compelling. I could explain the psychology of abuse in terms that were both academically sound and emotionally accessible, helping people understand complex dynamics through concrete examples and relatable scenarios. This work also connected me with researchers and policymakers who were working on systemic changes to better protect elderly people from exploitation and abuse. My case had helped establish important legal precedents, but there was still much work to be done in terms of prevention, early intervention, and support services for victims. Being part of efforts to change laws and policies, to improve training for professionals who work with elderly populations, to increase funding for victim services. All of this gave my personal experience broader significance that extended far beyond my individual recovery. The transformation from victim to advocate to policy influencer was something I never could have imagined when I was shuffling around that dim apartment, afraid to challenge Joe's authority. The ripple effects continued to expand in ways that sometimes amazed me. Former students reached out after seeing media coverage of my story, sharing how my strength and courage had inspired them in their own difficult situations. Colleagues from my teaching career expressed admiration for the way I'd rebuilt my life and found new purpose in advocacy work. Even strangers who heard me speak or read about my case would approach me at conferences or send letters describing how my example had given them hope or courage to make changes in their own lives. The realization that my terrible experience could be a source of inspiration and guidance for others was perhaps the most meaningful aspect of my entire transformation. Looking forward rather than backward, I can see that my 70s and beyond will be defined not by the limitations society expects of elderly women, but by the possibilities I create through my own choices and actions. The life I'm living now bears no resemblance to the quiet decline I'd been anticipating before Joe's abuse escalated to crisis levels. Instead of spending these years managing medications and doctor appointments and household maintenance with diminishing energy and enthusiasm, I'm traveling and learning and contributing to causes I care about with vitality and passion that surprises everyone who knew me during my marriage. The woman who rarely left our neighborhood has become someone comfortable navigating airports and foreign cities, who can give presentations to large audiences and hold her own in policy discussions with experts and officials. The health improvements that followed my liberation from Joe's systematic poisoning continue to amaze my doctors and inspire my peers. My cognitive function, which had been declining under the influence of the drugs he was giving me, not only returned to normal but seems sharper and more focused than it had been in years. Physical symptoms that I'd attributed to normal aging, chronic fatigue, joint pain, digestive issues, sleep disturbances, largely resolved once I was no longer under constant stress and chemical assault. The correlation between psychological abuse and physical health problems became starkly apparent as my body healed along with my mind and spirit. This recovery reinforced my understanding that many of the limitations we associate with aging are actually consequences of chronic stress, inadequate nutrition, lack of purpose and social connection, and sometimes deliberate sabotage by those who benefit from our decline. The vitality I've reclaimed in my 70s suggests that we severely underestimate what's possible for people in their later years when they're supported rather than suppressed. My relationship with Robert continues to evolve and deepen, providing a model of partnership that I use as an example when speaking to younger women about what to look for and what to avoid in romantic relationships. The contrast with my marriage to Joe is so dramatic that it sometimes feels like I'm living in a different universe entirely. Where Joe demanded complete devotion and compliance, Robert encourages my independence and celebrates my achievements. Where Joe isolates me from friends and activities, Robert supports my social connections and personal interests. Where Joe made me smaller and more dependent over time, Robert helps me grow stronger and more confident. The security I feel in this relationship doesn't come from Robert's protection or provision, but from his consistent respect for my autonomy and dignity. I know he would never try to control my behavior, steal my money, or undermine my confidence because those behaviors would be fundamentally inconsistent with his character and values. This sense of safety allows me to be more vulnerable and authentic than I was able to be with Joe, even in the early years of our marriage when I still trusted him completely. The hypervigilance and defensive postures I'd developed over decades of psychological manipulation have gradually relaxed. allowing for deeper intimacy than I ever experienced before. The physical relationship with Robert is also a revelation, both because of his gentleness and consideration and because of my own increased confidence and comfort with my body. Joe's criticism and control had extended to sexual intimacy, leaving me feeling inadequate and self-conscious about my appearance and responses. Robert's appreciation for who I am now, at 77, has helped me reclaim a sense of my own attractiveness and desirability that I thought was lost forever. The connection between psychological abuse and sexual dysfunction became clear as my confidence and responsiveness returned in an environment of genuine care and respect. This aspect of my recovery was something I rarely discussed in public presentations, but it was crucial for my complete healing and for understanding the full scope of what Joe's abuse had stolen from me. The restoration of physical intimacy and pleasure was as important as the financial and emotional recovery, representing another dimension of the life force that had been systematically suppressed. The possibility of remarriage has been something Robert and I have discussed, but we're both comfortable with the relationship as it is currently constituted. Having experienced the legal and financial complications of divorce, I'm somewhat reluctant to entangle my assets and decisions with another person's, even someone I trust as completely as I trust Robert. More importantly, the independence I fought so hard to reclaim feels precious and worth protecting. Not because I don't trust Robert, but because I've learned the value of maintaining my own identity and autonomy within any partnership. The balance we've achieved allows for deep connection and mutual support, while preserving the individual integrity that makes each of us interesting and attractive to the other. This approach to relationship has influenced how I advise other women, both those who are recovering from abusive marriages and those who are considering new partnerships later in life. The conventional wisdom that women need to be in relationships to be complete or secure is something I actively challenge, having discovered that the opposite is often true. The strongest foundation for any partnership is two people who are complete and secure as individuals, who choose to share their lives because they genuinely enjoy each other's company rather than because they need each other to meet basic emotional or practical needs. This model of relationship is particularly important for older adults who may be vulnerable to exploitation precisely because of their assumed neediness and dependence. My work with the Foundation has evolved to include education about healthy relationships and red flags for abuse, particularly targeted at recently widowed or divorced women who may be vulnerable to manipulation by predators who specifically target this population. The tactics used by romance scammers and financial predators often mirror those employed by abusive spouses, making elder abuse prevention education relevant for a wide range of situations. The connection between different types of victimization has become increasingly clear through my advocacy work and research collaboration with experts in criminology and gerontology. Elder abuse rarely occurs in isolation. It's often part of a pattern of exploitation that includes financial scams, healthcare fraud, and various forms of manipulation designed to separate older adults from their resources and autonomy. Understanding these broader patterns has helped me develop more comprehensive prevention strategies and educational programs that address the root causes of vulnerability rather than just the symptoms of abuse. The work has grown beyond my personal experience to encompass systemic issues about how society views and values older adults, particularly older women. The ageism and sexism that make elderly women targets for abuse are the same prejudices that lead to their voices being dismissed when they report mistreatment, their perceptions questioned when they describe manipulation, their competence doubted when they assert their rights and preferences. Addressing elder abuse effectively requires challenging the underlying assumptions about aging and gender that create vulnerability in the first place. This realization has led me to become involved in broader social justice work around issues of aging, disability rights, and gender equity. The speaking engagements now often address audiences beyond the elder abuse prevention community, including women's rights organizations, disability advocates, and policymakers working on issues related to aging and social services. The transformation from isolated victim to public advocate to social justice activist has been perhaps the most unexpected aspect of my recovery. The woman who was afraid to speak up in her own home has become someone comfortable challenging societal assumptions and institutional practices that harm vulnerable populations. The confidence required for this level of public engagement developed gradually, built through hundreds of small acts of courage and self-assertion that began with switching those water glasses and refusing to accept Joe's version of reality. Each time I stood up for myself or someone else, each time I challenged unfair treatment or demanded respect, I grew stronger and more capable of taking on bigger challenges. This progression from personal recovery to public advocacy seems to be a common pattern among abuse survivors who have successfully rebuilt their lives. The strength developed through surviving and escaping victimization often translates into a passionate commitment to protecting others from similar experiences. The work provides meaning and purpose that transforms past suffering into present contribution, creating a positive legacy from experiences that could otherwise remain purely destructive. For me, the knowledge that my story might help other women recognize abuse earlier, seek help sooner, or find courage to leave dangerous situations makes every difficult day of recovery feel worthwhile. The letters and emails I continue to receive from women who've been inspired by my example to take action in their own lives are treasures I keep in a special file, reminders of the ripple effects that continue to spread from that one night when I chose to trust my instincts over my conditioning. Some describe leaving abusive relationships they'd endured for decades, finding the courage to prioritize their safety and dignity over fear of being alone. Others tell of standing up to adult children who were exploiting their financial generosity or taking advantage of their willingness to provide free childcare and household services. Still others share stories of smaller but significant changes, learning to say no to unreasonable requests, setting boundaries with demanding family members, pursuing interests and activities their husbands had previously forbidden, taking control of family finances they'd allowed others to manage. Each story represents a life improved, a person who refused to accept mistreatment as inevitable, a woman who chose to value herself enough to demand better. The collective impact of these individual transformations is impossible to measure, but undoubtedly significant in terms of changing expectations and norms around how elderly women are treated and what they're willing to accept. The foundation work has also connected me with the next generation of advocates and activists, young people who bring energy and technological skills and fresh perspectives to the work of preventing elder abuse and supporting survivors. Their commitment to the cause gives me hope that the problems I've experienced will become increasingly rare as awareness grows and prevention strategies improve. Working with graduate students and young professionals has also kept me intellectually stimulated and current with new research and evolving best practices in the field. The mentor relationships I've developed with some of these younger advocates have been mutually beneficial, allowing me to share experiential wisdom while learning new approaches and perspectives from people who bring different backgrounds and training to the work. These intergenerational collaborations have been particularly valuable in developing educational materials and outreach strategies that can reach diverse populations with prevention messages and support resources. My lived experience combined with their research skills and cultural competence creates programming that is both emotionally authentic and evidence-based. The technology skills I've had to develop for this work, creating presentations, managing databases, participating in webinars and video conferences, have been challenging but empowering for someone who had never used a computer for anything more complex than email when Joe was still controlling my daily activities. Learning these new competencies in my 70s has been another aspect of discovering capabilities I never knew I possessed. Potential that had been suppressed during decades of being told I was too old or too technologically challenged to master new skills. The confidence that comes from successfully adapting to changing communication tools and platforms has transferred to other areas where I'd previously felt intimidated or inadequate. The speaking engagements now often include virtual presentations that reach audiences I could never have accessed through in-person events alone. The ability to participate in conferences and training sessions around the world from my apartment in New York has exponentially expanded the reach and impact of the educational work I'm doing. This technological competence has also enhanced my personal relationships, allowing me to stay connected with friends and family members who live far away, to participate in online communities of other advocates and survivors, to access educational and entertainment resources that enrich my daily life. The woman who felt isolated and cut off from the world during the final years of her marriage now has connections and communication channels that span the globe, bringing stimulation and companionship that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. The digital literacy skills have also made me more confident about financial management and less vulnerable to the kinds of manipulation Joe used to maintain control over our resources. Being able to access account information online, research investment options, communicate directly with financial advisors and legal counsel has eliminated the dependence on others' interpretations and representations that made his deception possible. This independence in managing my own affairs has been crucial for maintaining the autonomy I fought so hard to reclaim. No longer do I need to rely on anyone else's expertise or judgment about my financial situation. I have the tools and knowledge to monitor my own accounts, make my own decisions, and verify information independently. The empowerment that comes from financial literacy and independence cannot be overstated, particularly for women of my generation who were often excluded from family financial decisions and discouraged from developing expertise in money management. Taking control of my finances was as important for my recovery as addressing the psychological and emotional trauma of Joe's abuse. Understanding investments, tax implications, estate planning, and other aspects of financial management has also allowed me to make strategic decisions about philanthropy and legacy planning that reflect my values and priorities rather than someone else's agenda. The foundation work is just one example of how I'm using recovered assets to create positive change and support causes I care about. The estate planning process has been particularly meaningful, allowing me to ensure that my remaining years and eventual legacy contribute to protecting other vulnerable adults from the kind of exploitation I experienced. Rather than leaving everything to family members who might not share my values or priorities, I've been able to create a plan that supports both my loved ones and the broader cause of elder abuse prevention. This approach to end-of-life planning reflects the broader transformation in how I think about my purpose and impact in the world. Instead of seeing myself as a burden who needs to minimize her needs and maximize her usefulness to others, I now view myself as someone with valuable resources, time, money, experience, knowledge, that can be strategically deployed to create positive change. The shift from seeing myself as a potential victim who needed protection to seeing myself as an agent of change who could protect others has been perhaps the most profound aspect of my personal transformation. The power dynamics that Joe worked so hard to establish and maintain have been completely reversed, with me now in a position of influence and authority that serves vulnerable populations rather than exploiting them. This reversal is evident in every aspect of my current life, from the way I carry myself in public to the respect I command in professional settings to the deference shown to my expertise and experience by people who work in elder abuse prevention and survivor support. The recognition I've received for the advocacy work, awards from professional organizations, invitations to serve on policy committees, requests to testify before legislative bodies, represents acknowledgement of my transformation from victim to expert, from someone who needed help to someone who provides it. These external validations are gratifying, but the internal satisfaction of knowing I've turned my worst experience into something that benefits others is the more lasting reward. The meaning and purpose I've found through advocacy work has given my later years significance and impact that far exceeds anything I achieved during my decades as a teacher, despite the value of that work. The integration of all these experiences, surviving abuse, rebuilding my life, finding new love, pursuing advocacy work, developing expertise in areas I'd never explored, has created a sense of wholeness and authenticity that I never experienced during my marriage or early recovery period. I am more fully myself now at 77 than I was at 27, more confident in my judgment, more comfortable with my preferences, more willing to take risks and try new things despite the possibility of failure or criticism. The woman who emerged from that terrible night when I switched our water glasses bears little resemblance to the person who'd been slowly disappearing under Joe's systematic abuse. But she also represents the fulfillment of potential that had always existed but had never been allowed to develop fully. The courage, intelligence, resilience, and compassion that enabled my survival and recovery weren't newly created by the crisis. They were qualities that had been present throughout my life, but suppressed and redirected to serve someone else's agenda. The process of reclaiming these aspects of my personality and developing them more fully has been like archaeologists uncovering artifacts that reveal the true scope of an ancient civilization. Each layer of recovery revealed capabilities and interests and strengths that had been buried under decades of conditioning and control. The woman I've become is both entirely new and fundamentally familiar, someone who represents both transformation and restoration. The girl who'd graduated from Teachers College with big dreams and boundless optimism had never disappeared entirely. She'd been waiting patiently for the opportunity to re-emerge and claim her rightful place in the world. This sense of continuity with my younger self while celebrating the wisdom and strength that come with age has been essential for integrating the traumatic experience with the positive outcomes that followed. I am not defined by what Joe did to me, but neither do I ignore or minimize the impact of those experiences on who I've become. The balance between acknowledging the reality of abuse while refusing to be permanently damaged by it is something I emphasize when speaking to other survivors who struggle with shame, anger, and ongoing effects of their victimization. Recovery doesn't mean forgetting or forgiving or pretending the abuse didn't matter. It means transforming the experience into wisdom, strength, and purpose. The ongoing process of healing and growth continues to surprise me with new insights and opportunities for development. Just when I think I've fully processed the experience and moved beyond its influence, some new situation or relationship or challenge reveals another layer of impact that needs attention and integration. But instead of feeling frustrated by the ongoing nature of recovery, I've learned to see it as evidence of the depth and complexity of human resilience. The fact that I continue to grow and change and discover new aspects of myself well into my 70s suggests that the human capacity for adaptation and development extends far beyond what our ageist society typically recognizes or supports. The relationships I've built with other survivors, advocates, and professionals in the field have created a community of people who understand both the devastating impact of abuse and the extraordinary potential for recovery and transformation. These connections provide ongoing support and inspiration that sustain the work and enrich my personal life in ways that extend far beyond the professional collaboration. Being part of a movement to change how society understands and responds to elder abuse has given my individual experience collective significance that multiplies its impact. The personal truly has become political, with my private recovery contributing to public policy changes that will benefit countless others who might otherwise suffer in silence and isolation. The legislative testimony I've provided, the training programs I've helped develop, the research studies I've participated in, all represent ways that surviving Joe's abuse has contributed to systemic changes that extend far beyond my individual case. The transformation from victim to survivor to advocate to change agent has created a legacy that will outlast my lifetime. This sense of lasting impact has been crucial for finding meaning in the suffering and making peace with the years that were lost to manipulation and control. While I can't recover the time and opportunities that Joe's abuse cost me, I can ensure that my experience serves to protect others from similar victimization and to improve support services for those who do experience abuse. The Foundation's work continues to expand, now supporting research projects, educational initiatives, and advocacy campaigns that address different aspects of elder abuse prevention and survivor support. The initial focus on legal assistance has broadened to include mental health services, financial counseling, housing assistance, and other support services that address the complex needs of abuse survivors. The holistic approach reflects my own experience of recovery, which required attention to physical, emotional, financial, legal, and social dimensions of healing. No single intervention would have been sufficient to address all the ways that Joe's abuse had impacted my life and functioning. This comprehensive understanding of survivor needs has influenced the Foundation's grant-making priorities and partnership strategies, ensuring that funded programs address the full spectrum of challenges that elder abuse victims face when trying to escape dangerous situations and rebuild their lives. The ripple effects continue to expand in ways I never anticipated when I first decided to share my story publicly. The case has been used in law school courses, social work training programs, medical school curricula, and continuing education for financial professionals, helping to educate new generations of practitioners about recognizing and responding to elder abuse. Research based on my case and others like it has contributed to better understanding of how systematic psychological manipulation affects cognitive function in elderly victims, leading to improved diagnostic criteria and treatment approaches for abuse-related trauma. The medical implications of being drugged without knowledge have informed protocols for emergency room personnel and primary care physicians who treat elderly patients with unexplained symptoms. The financial aspects of the case have influenced banking regulations and training programs for financial institution employees, helping them recognize signs of exploitation and coercion in elderly customers' account management. The complex web of hidden accounts and fraudulent transfers has become a case study in forensic accounting programs and law enforcement training on financial crimes against seniors. Each of these applications multiplies the impact of my individual experience, transforming one woman's survival story into educational resource that can prevent countless other victimizations. The knowledge that professionals across multiple disciplines are learning from what happened to me gives additional meaning to the suffering and validates the decision to turn private trauma into public education. The international attention the case has received has also led to speaking invitations and consulting opportunities in other countries where elder abuse prevention efforts are still in early stages of development. The universal aspects of family dynamics, aging, and vulnerability transcend cultural boundaries, making the lessons from my experience relevant for diverse populations and contexts. These international connections have enriched my understanding of how different societies approach aging, family responsibility, and protection of vulnerable adults. Some cultures provide more robust support systems for elderly citizens, while others rely more heavily on family-based care that can create opportunities for exploitation similar to what I experienced. The comparative perspective has influenced my advocacy work in the United States, highlighting both strengths and gaps in our current approach to elder abuse prevention and suggesting policy innovations that have been successful in other countries with similar challenges. The global nature of this work has also connected me with advocates and researchers around the world who are addressing similar issues in their own contexts. These collaborations have led to joint research projects, shared educational resources, and coordinated advocacy campaigns that leverage collective expertise and influence. Being part of an international movement to protect elderly people from abuse and exploitation has given my personal recovery journey significance that extends far beyond individual healing. The connections formed through this work have become sources of friendship, intellectual stimulation, and ongoing inspiration that continue to fuel my commitment to the cause. The travel associated with speaking engagements and consulting work has also provided opportunities to see how other societies value and support their aging populations, offering models for policy and practice improvements that could benefit American elders. These experiences have broadened my perspective and reinforced my commitment to working for systemic changes rather than just individual case advocacy. The woman who was once afraid to leave her neighborhood is now comfortable traveling internationally, speaking to diverse audiences, and participating in policy discussions with government officials and institutional leaders. The transformation in confidence and competence has been as dramatic as any other aspect of my recovery. This global perspective has also influenced my approach to the Foundation's work, encouraging partnerships with international organizations and support for research and advocacy efforts in other countries where resources for elder abuse prevention are limited. The interconnected nature of the problem requires coordinated responses that transcend national boundaries. The technology platforms that enable virtual participation in international conferences and collaborations have made it possible to maintain these global connections while still being based in New York. The combination of local grounding and international engagement creates a perfect balance for someone who values both community connection and broader impact. As I approach my 80th birthday, the life I'm living bears no resemblance to what I expected when Joe was systematically undermining my health and independence. Instead of declining into confusion and dependency as he had planned, I'm thriving in ways that surprise everyone who knew me during the marriage. The energy and enthusiasm I bring to each day, the curiosity and openness to new experiences, the confidence and authority I display in professional settings, all represent a dramatic reversal of the trajectory Joe had engineered through his systematic abuse. His attempt to destroy my capacity for independent life instead catalyzed a transformation that revealed capabilities I never knew I possessed. The irony is not lost on me that his worst intentions contributed to my best outcomes, that his efforts to diminish and control me ultimately freed me to become more fully myself than I had ever been before. The woman who emerged from that crisis is stronger, wiser, more confident, and more impactful than she would have been without the catalyst of abuse and recovery. This doesn't mean I'm grateful for what Joe did to me, or that I would choose to experience such systematic betrayal and manipulation. The suffering was real, and the damage was significant, requiring years of intensive work to address and overcome. The costs, financial, emotional, physical, relational, were enormous and could easily have been permanent. But the capacity for growth and transformation that the crisis revealed has been extraordinary, suggesting that human resilience and adaptability extend far beyond what we typically expect or support, particularly in older adults who are often written off as incapable of significant change or development. The life I'm living now, rich with meaningful work, genuine relationships, creative expression, intellectual stimulation, and purposeful contribution, would have been impossible within the constraints of my marriage to Joe. His need for control and my compliance with it had created a prison that was slowly strangling my spirit and potential. The key that unlocked that prison was the moment I chose to trust my own perceptions over his manipulation, to value my own safety and dignity more than his comfort and control. Everything that followed, the legal battles, the financial recovery, the advocacy work, the new relationships, the travel and learning and growth, stemmed from that one act of rebellion when I switched our water glasses. The lesson for other women facing similar situations is that it's never too late to choose yourself, to prioritize your own well-being, to demand respect and dignity in your relationships. The fear of being alone, of losing financial security, of disrupting family harmony. These concerns are real, but they pale in comparison to the cost of accepting systematic abuse and exploitation. The strength required to break free from long-standing patterns of victimization exists within every survivor, even when it's been dormant for decades. The process of accessing and developing that strength may be difficult and frightening, but it's possible at any age and under almost any circumstances. The support systems and resources available to elder abuse victims have improved significantly in recent years, partly due to advocacy efforts by survivors like myself who have shared their stories and worked for policy changes. Help is available for those who are ready to seek it, and the outcomes can be transformative in ways that extend far beyond simply escaping abusive situations. My story is ultimately one of liberation and empowerment, of discovering that it's possible to rebuild your life completely, even in your 70s, after decades of systematic oppression. The woman who was once afraid to speak up in her own home became someone whose voice carries authority and influence in policy discussions and professional settings. The transformation from victim to survivor to advocate to change agent represents not just personal recovery, but contribution to a broader movement for social justice and protection of vulnerable populations. The individual healing process became a source of collective benefit that continues to expand and multiply. Have you ever found yourself questioning your own perceptions while someone close to you insists their version of reality is correct? Have you ever felt like you were slowly disappearing in a relationship that was supposed to nurture and support you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters, and someone reading this might need to hear that they're not alone, that recovery is possible, that it's never too late to choose yourself. If this resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Your engagement helps ensure that stories like mine reach other people who might be living in situations they don't yet recognize as abusive, who might benefit from knowing that transformation is possible at any age, under any circumstances. Thank you for listening, and remember, you deserve respect, dignity, and genuine love in all your relationships.